Etiquette. There we go, right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can I ask everyone to start taking their seats? We'll start imminently. We'll start now. First of all, welcome, Jošte Kivanok. Welcome to the Danube Institute. There are obviously a lot of familiar faces here. My name is Callum Nicholson. I'm Director of Research here at the Danube Institute. Today, we're very honored to have a presentation by Timothy Burns, and this is going to be on Machiavelli, Moses and David, writing God out of the Bible, and the launching of modernity. And today's session will be moderated by our former researcher here and friend and colleague Adam Darabosh, who's a researcher now at the Axioma Center, as well as at the Institute for Religion and Society at Ludovica University of Public Service. But the star here that we're all here to see, of course we're also here to see Adam, is Professor Timothy Burns, who's Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. His most recent book is Leo Strauss and Modern Democracy by SUNY Press, published in 2022. And he's been here over the last week delivering a seminar series for our researchers and also our interns on Western civilization and what has happened to it. And so today's lecture, I think, will be touching on a lot of themes that are relevant to that, and we're very much looking forward to it. I'll hand it over now to Professor Burns, who will speak for the next 45 minutes or so, perhaps slightly longer, and then he and Adam will have a discussion, and then open it up to questions. So prepare your questions for the question section. Thank you very much. Timothy Burns.
Thank you, Caleb, and thanks to the Danube Institute for having me here. It's wonderful to be back. Thank you all for coming. In The Prince, which many of you perhaps have read, Machiavelli rewrites the biblical accounts of Moses, of David and Goliath, and of God's providence. The rewritings are a crucial component of his launch of modern political philosophy, which has decisively reshaped the world that we inhabit. The radical intention of Machiavelli's rewritings becomes fully intelligible only with a grasp of the original biblical teachings that they're meant to replace: prophetically revealed law, kingship, and providence. This evening, I'm going to attempt to elucidate those biblical teachings with particular attention to kingship and Machiavelli's comprehensive counter-teachings. As we'll see, Machiavelli seeks to restore the way of kings of Israel, but on a new, comprehensively anti-providential and explicitly technological basis. If we're to recover the biblical understanding against which Machiavelli and his philosophic followers launched their attack, we have to go back briefly first to the biblical beginning. God creates the world, separating things into kinds in an account that deprecates the heavens and their bodies, even as it elevates the status of man, the being who has not only locomotion and growth, but, as we soon learn, can go quite wrong. Originally put in a bountiful garden, Adam and Eve disobey God's command not to eat of the fruit of a single tree, the tree of good and evil. By freely disobeying, they lose the childlike simplicity in which they were first created. There was no necessity that they eat from it, and so they are fully, morally responsible for their deed, and they're punished with expulsion from the garden. In fact, the biblical redactors carefully refrain from using the word necessity or nature here or anywhere else. There's no word for those two things in biblical Hebrew. All is created and therefore contingent, dependent on a creative God. Machiavelli, by contrast, who repeatedly invites us to take our bearings from alleged necessity, calls our attention to its exculpatory nature. He indicates that he and we reasonably and regularly excuse. We don't blame those who are necessitated to do what they do when transgressing. He argues that it is a truly very natural and ordinary thing to desire to acquire, and thereby invites us to extend this exculpation to many things. The Bible steers us in Genesis and throughout away from such autonomous understanding, which inevitably leads to claims about necessity. It steers us away, therefore, from cultivation of arts or technology, especially in arms. Perhaps the clearest indication of this is the presentation of cities and of arts, such as bronze and ironworking. They arise not from the line of Abel or Seth, shepherds who rely on the land, but from the line of Cain, the settled farmer. The great Tower of Babel is, of course, destroyed by God. The artful or technologically maintained Egypt is a despotism, including many chariots of war in Pharaoh's armies, from which the Israelites are to be delivered. Israelite kings will be forbidden to use chariots and directed away from the way of Egypt. Yet after Adam and Eve's expulsion from the garden, a series of concessions are made by God. Concessions first to humans, and then to his chosen, if wayward, people. Even Adam and Eve don't die on the day they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Cain is not put to death for slaying Abel, but made to wander. The prohibition against eating meat becomes, with Noah, a prohibition against eating meat with blood. And God promises that he will never again destroy the earth. After the Tower of Babel's building and destruction, God merely scatters humans into nations and chooses one of them as his holy people. God has Moses institute for the Israelites, who are frightened by his voice, the practice of sacrificing. Even human arts, including metallurgy, come to be sanctioned in the building of the Ark of the Covenant and in the building of the temple, or in general, in giving glory to God. One of the biggest of these concessions to human weakness is the permission to institute kingship, something the Israelites demand with an explicit demand to be like other nations. We'll return to this final concession in part 2. Moses' promulgation of the laws comes to Israel as the penultimate of this long series of concessions. As we learn in Exodus 19:9, God tells Moses that he will come in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when he speaks with Moses and believe and trust Moses forever. They will hear, they won't see. They will be in a position of trust in Moses as the prophet of what God will say. And God reveals to the people, and perhaps to Moses himself, that it's through God's law, given to his prophet Moses, that they will be made holy. In fact, when God speaks the beginning of the law initially, they fear that they'll die. And Moses directs them to fear instead God, that is, to fear sinning. The preferred route to God, we can say, is through hearkening to the directly given law and through imitation of his loving kindness and righteousness and sanctification of time in the Sabbath. Second best is following the law. What then is the purpose of the law? To make clear the way that the people should live in order to become not only a righteous but a holy nation, a people set apart. Accordingly, Moses' speeches are addressed to the people, not simply to the elders. It's in their hands to help the law, Moses indicates. Moses attempts to put his own influence aside and let the people know that it's their responsibility. And this is expressed no more clearly than in the words that Moses speaks in Deuteronomy 6, including the Shema, in accord with the command that these laws be in their hearts and written on their doorposts. Moses reviews the covenant that was made on Mount Horeb with their fathers. And as we see, Israelites will, through following the law, be seen by the nations, the Goyim, as wise if they keep and do the laws, the statutes, and the judgments. The law will be seen as wise and great by the nations. That is to say, the nations are not above their ken. These laws are manifestly the right way, and their being so entails the rule of God, not of Moses, whose prophetic judgments, which had hitherto directed Israel, are replaced by the law. The rule of law is, in short, to be an exemplary theocracy. We begin our inquiry into Machiavelli's critique of such theocracy in chapter 6 of The Prince. At the start of the chapter, Machiavelli indicates that he will be discussing the loftiest examples. He speaks of such men as men of virtue, virtu, and we begin to see what he means by virtue. One can, he argues, found a principality on fortune or chance, or one can found it on virtue. Those are the two comprehensive choices. In this chapter, he discusses those who found it on virtue, building something altogether new, he says. In the next chapter, he discusses those who found it on fortune, including Cesare Borgia. Among the greatest examples of those who found on virtue are Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. All were revered by their followers. All were founders of the Greek, the Roman, and the Persian ways of life. And the list includes Moses, the founder of the Israelites and hence of Judaism. These examples Machiavelli presents as being above all others. There's an extraordinary difference between these four and all others. Of the four named, Moses would seem to be the highest. He had, says Machiavelli, the grace that made him worthy of speaking with God. Machiavelli admits and even stresses then that Moses cuts a strange sight in this chapter. He was a prophet, and according to the Bible, the greatest of prophets, the spokesman for God, the authoritative spokesman for the transcendent truth, the only prophet to have genuinely seen God, if only his backside. Machiavelli puts him together with three great men from profane history. What is Moses' relation to them, then? Machiavelli himself draws our attention to this question. One should not reason about Moses, he says. And one might expect him to add, because revelation is above reason. Instead, he says, because he was a mere executor of things ordered for him by God. That is, Moses is below the other three. He was merely God's right-hand man, an adjutant. Moses, then, is either lower than the others, if our standard is human accomplishment, or infinitely, unspeakably higher, if viewed from a biblical perspective. The striking thing is that Moses does not belong in this chapter. He's either too high or too low. Since he doesn't belong here, Machiavelli puts him aside. But let us consider then Cyrus and the others, he says. But having declared this, Machiavelli does not put Moses aside. If you examine their actions, you will find that they do not differ from those of Moses, who had so great a teacher. Either God was coaching Moses on how to be politically successful, and all the other three, these pagans, knew the true divine lessons without having to talk to God, or God is superfluous in explaining the actions of the others, and so too of Moses. His actions are equal to their actions. If they did the same as he did, then one needn't have so great a teacher as Moses had. If the others succeeded without God, so could Moses. Instead of being the faithful servant of anyone, Moses would be his own man, inventing a divine code just as the others did. He would be promoted from a worldly standpoint, but demoted from the biblical standpoint. He would be one of a number of merely worldly founders. In fact, in the final chapter of The Prince, Machiavelli speaks, and I'm quoting now, of extraordinary things without precedent. He's talking to Lorenzo. Contemporary, extraordinary things without precedent. What are they? The sea has opened. A cloud has escorted you along the way. The stone has poured forth water. Here, manna has rained. So the very miracles that are ascribed to Moses in Exodus. What Machiavelli says next on virtue and fortune indicates that this is the case, that in fact Moses was merely a worldly founder. And as one examines their actions and lives, he says, one does not see that they had anything else from fortune than the opportunity, which gave them the matter, enabling them to introduce any form they pleased. Machiavelli here employs the technical terms form and matter, and he implicitly denies that there's any form, either by nature or by divine creation, that's to be understood, grasped, looked up to, or followed. The founders introduced whatever form they pleased into the matter. They acted as God or gods, without reference to anything above them or anything self-subsisting in setting up their ways of life. In doing so, they relied on their own virtue. At least the other three did. All they got from fortune was the opportunity to make virtue shine. Is Machiavelli talking of Moses as well? He is indeed. The very first example that he gives of the virtuous use of opportunity is precisely that of Moses, who found the Israelites enslaved in Egypt. Machiavelli, that is, clearly assimilates Moses to the other three, thereby stripping Moses of the claim to have acted on behalf of a power greater than himself. Moses saw his opportunity and took it. He acted on his own and should be viewed in a merely human light. Now, what were the motives of these four founders, and what's the justification for these motives? To found their state and their security, says Machiavelli. That's why they introduced these orders and modes. And what are these orders and modes? The ones Moses introduced are, of course, spelled out in the Pentateuch. As we've seen, Moses did what he did in order to follow God's intention, according to the Bible, of bringing the Israelites under the divine law. The founding was for the sake of the law, written in their hearts. As Machiavelli presents it, the law, that is, the new orders and modes, are not the end, but are merely means to Moses' state and security. The law, and by implication, God himself, are merely means to Moses' worldly ends. Machiavelli's presentation of God's book excludes God from that book. Moses wasn't the servant of God or God's law. Rather, the law is the servant of Moses. To obey the law is to further Moses' glory. It has no higher reason. The high or any permanent moral truth in the light of which we act is shown to be merely a creation of ambitious men. The grounding of this argument comes in what Machiavelli says next about the new orders and modes. The introducer of new orders, says Machiavelli, has lukewarm defenders, and when they no longer believe, one can make them believe by force. As a result, all armed prophets, he says, succeed. Unarmed prophets were ruined. The old distinction between true and false prophets thus gives way in Machiavelli's presentation to that between armed and unarmed. Truth is altogether without power in human affairs. It's the arms that prevail. One needs arms because when people cease to believe in you, you must make them believe. And not, we note, merely force them to act as you wish. Belief can be compelled by arms. Through arms, old gods are scared out of the people, and fear of the new gods is put in. Armed force, wielded on behalf of prophecy, compels belief. And if this is indeed the case, the armed prophet not only has to make men believe by force, there's nothing to prevent him from doing so, because there are no standards that have not been introduced by armed prophets serving their own ends. Machiavelli makes it clear that this includes Moses. Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus would not have been able to make their people observe their constitutions for long, he says, if they had been unarmed. The sword of the Levites, mowing down the worshippers of the golden calf, that's what secured his success. When we notice and absorb Machiavelli's radical teaching, we may be inclined to view this extraordinary and to some perhaps shocking claim of Machiavelli as evidence of a crucial step in the march toward the Enlightenment and its disenchantment of the world. And Machiavelli's explicit followers, Francis Bacon and Benedict de Spinoza, as well as his less explicit followers, such as Thomas Hobbes, certainly took up just such a mission. But lest we think, in addition, that this step was made possible by an historical advance in human consciousness, it's important to note that Machiavelli's central claim that Moses invented his claim to speak as a prophet of God, that he invented the law and merely claimed that it was divine, that's not something new at all. It's found in the Bible itself, forming a key part of the rebellion of Korah and his followers, Dathan, Abiram, and On, against Moses. The claim is found in Numbers 16. We can't go into the details of Korah's democratic rebellion, but at the heart of it are two somewhat contradictory claims. First, the entire congregation is holy, they claim. Why do you raise yourself up above it? This is made on the basis of a previously stated call or promise. You are to be to me a priestly holy nation. You've taken too much upon yourself, say Korah and his followers, seeking to make yourself prince. Moses throws their charge right back at them, except that he isn't saying you're assuming too much of a burden when he says you're taking too much on yourselves. He's accusing them of seeking greatness, the very thing he eschews. That's the whole dispute, seeking greatness through rule. It is to this that Moses objects, and his objection is on the rebels' ground. They had accused Moses of seeking greatness, of seeking to be a prince. They're now looking to have what Aaron and his sons have, the office of ritual priests of the tabernacle, a title to rule. This indeed would be, he implies, a great thing, but what they already have is no small thing. The rebels claim next that Moses has brought them out of the land of Egypt, which was itself a land of milk and honey, and he's done this to make himself prince, sarar, over them. We see what you're doing, they claim. You think you can blot our eyes out like slaves? Their implicit claim is that Moses has made God up to make himself prince. They offer the Machiavellian reading of Moses. In his reply, which Moses speaks to the Lord, not to them, he says, I've taken nothing from them, as princes do, acting in their own self-interest. With no divine reply to this, Moses acts. He sets up on his own a trial by ordeal, and we receive, in verse 28, a direct confirmation that the implication of the rebels' claim is indeed that Moses, not God, is behind the deeds. You have made God up to make yourself prince. Moses denies it. It is not a work of mine own mind or heart, heaven. And then he sets the terms in a manner that takes it out of his hands. Now, one could certainly argue that this event never happened. That Moses, the author of the Pentateuch, or the redactors, made all of this up also, in furtherance of his modes and orders. But one cannot claim that Moses or the redactors were unaware of this possibility, this charge against him. The Bible, that is not written by or for a naive or historically backward and hence deeply gullible people, such as the Athenian stranger, for example, speaks of in Book 3 of Plato's Laws. As they're fully aware of the arts and what they represent, of the path to human autonomy, so are the redactors aware of human artfulness with respect to law or political life. They present it to their readers. They present it as a mistaken path to life. To cleave to the commandments, as Moses finally declares in Deuteronomy 30, is to cleave to life. And he bids them choose life. But how is the Mosaic law to be enforced after Moses' death? It will eventually be by kings. This is first raised as a future eventuality at the end of Genesis 36, in the list of the descendants of Esau in the land of Edom, who become kings. And these are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. Kingship, we're here informed, will eventually come. But it's an institution to which the alternative line of Jacob, Esau, is first drawn. To be sure, the Mosaic laws themselves include, at Deuteronomy 17:14-20, stipulations concerning the king, whom they will eventually have. It must be someone who's part of the covenant. And in chapter 18, reference is made to the true prophets whom God will raise up, since it is repeated, the people do not wish to hear the word of God directly. Those prophets will guide even under the kingships. And it is a true prophet and judge, Samuel, who will end up choosing the king. The king is to have no horses, no chariots, no multiple wives, no gold and silver, no going back to the way of Pharaoh. That is, the king is to be subject to God's laws, even copying them out by hand, which the priests will hand to him. Moses, moreover, begs the people not to fall into the trap of king. That is, of thinking once they have the land, the promised land, of forgetting God and thinking that they have made all of this and need a king to preserve it, like other nations. The land, he reminds them, is an inheritance. This is the same word as was used with the patriarchs. The real challenge isn't conquering. God will assist them in that. The real challenge is living according to the law. The Israelites are called upon to see political reality ever in a moral way, in accord with the law, and thereby manifest the right way. There'll be military power and food and wealth, but it's not these that allow them to inherit the land and to keep it. Far to be preferred to kingship, moreover, is what comes first, the rule of judges. After the rule of Joshua, Israel is ruled, as we learn in the book of Judges, by an intermittent series of judges who arise non-institutionally to rescue them from the rule of other peoples and their gods, under which and into which they perpetually slide. These peoples were left by Joshua in and around the land of Canaan. We may say that Joshua became old and died before he finished his conquest of the promised land. That's the human, all too human explanation. But the biblical redactors explain, no, those people were left there to serve as a test of the Israelites. But kingship, when it comes, does allow for the rule of 3 prophetically directed kings. and we may again call the rule of these good kings an indirect theocracy. We are now almost prepared to understand the second of Machiavelli's retellings of the biblical narrative, the story of David and Goliath. Here we'll look first at the biblical account and then at Machiavelli's rewriting of it. It comes in Samuel, a book named after the last and greatest of the judges. After his birth, his mother dedicates him as a Nazirite to the Lord, so he grows up in the temple of Shiloh, under the eye of Eli the priest. From a very early age, he is and is called by the people a prophet, for having boldly declared what the Lord had told him, that Eli's 2 sons are corrupt, demanding sexual favors from the women who come to the temple. Though he's not of the tribe of the Levites, Samuel the prophet becomes a priest and a judge. So he is priest, prophet, and judge in one. He's the last of the good judges of Israel. He's a circuit judge. But his own 2 judging sons become corrupt too, demanding even by force the best of the sacrifices to eat and having sexual relations with the women who come to the temple. That corruption, together with Samuel's age and the Israelites' persistent difficulties with their enemies, moves the Israelites to demand from Samuel a king. Tellingly, they express this wish as a wish to be like all other nations. Samuel warns them, in the name of Yahweh, that the king will oppress them. They demand one all the same. And God tells Samuel to grant their request, that they're rebelling not against Samuel, but against God. The Bible thus sets up the presentation of the story of David in this way. Kings are contrary to God's plan, and he's agreeing to them is the final concession. How, we might wonder, will God turn this concession into an advance in the life of his people and of humanity? We're first shown the great difficulty of it. We see how the first king, Saul, is a failure, so that we can see over and against his rule what a true king of Israel is. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the Bible's account of Saul and how he goes wrong. I'll say only this. Saul treats the commands of the Lord, whether they be Mosaic law or commands coming directly from Samuel, as annoying rituals that must be performed. They're performative, to use a favorite term of our own contemporary discourse. Saul consequently comes to pursue his own honor, even building a monument to himself. And he will eventually die by suicide, falling on his sword in a losing battle against the Philistines. Saul's pursuit of his own worldly honor and his corresponding relegation of God's commands to an afterthought is why Samuel the prophet tells Saul God has rejected him. God then chooses a king from among the sons of Jesse, ordering the sad and frightened Samuel to travel to Bethlehem to anoint the new king. As the sons of Jesse come to the sacrifice Samuel's prepared, he espies the eldest and thinks he's the one. But God rebukes him. At 16:7. But Yahweh said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I've refused him. For Yahweh seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but Yahweh looketh on the heart. Saul, tall Saul, had needed a new heart, and he loses it. This time God is going directly for one whom he sees as already possessing the needed heart. The phrase is striking. God sees not as man sees, the outward appearance. He's looking for a leader, in fact, who doesn't see, but rather hearkens to God's voice, his word, and in this way leads his people. Jesse has his next 2 sons, Abinadab and Shammah, pass by Samuel, and then 7 other sons. None proves to be the one. Samuel asks, are there any others? Jesse says, yeah, the youngest. He's tending the sheep. No surprise, this is a shepherd. He's the man who's to become the second and the supremely successful Israelite king. Almost all subsequent kings are compared to David and found wanting. We get our first look at him. He's ruddy, admoni, as Esau was said to be when he was born. He spends his time outdoors. He's beautiful. He has a beautiful face, as has been said of Rachel. And he's goodly to look at, which had been said even in the superlative of Saul. So David's attractive, though he's not tall. He's just a boy. That's the outward appearance. It isn't why God has chosen him, and that's made quite explicit. David's anointed king by Samuel, but only before his family, not before Israel. But this brings the Spirit of the Lord upon David. Before any public anointing of David, much will transpire. The most important of these is what we move to now, to what we might say everything in the Bible has been building toward, the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. Everything comes together here, and one could almost say it's all downhill from here, certainly in Kings, with few exceptions. We pick up the story in 1 Samuel 17. The Philistines are threatening, again, in the land of Judah. They're on the mount. On one mount, the Israelites are on the other, and there's a valley between them. And we're told of Goliath. He's about 7.5 feet tall. He's heavily clad in armor, about 125 pounds worth. His spear weighs 12 pounds. He's a human tank. He's technology incarnate. At 17, 8 to 10, he speaks. His offer is that instead of the armies fighting, one person will fight one another, and whoever wins will thereby have victory for his whole people and enslave the others. It's to be a battle of champions. Goliath understands himself and the Philistines to be fighting the servants of Saul and the armies of Israel. He says nothing of Yahweh. We're then told the reaction of Saul and his troops at verse 11. There isn't a brave fighter among them. Or rather, as we'll now be reminded by David, there isn't any among them that has trust in God. David had, as we are told explicitly in verse 15, returned from Saul to his father to feed the sheep, and now his father sends him to camp of Saul's forces against the Philistines, where David's 3 eldest brothers are fighting, just to bring them some food. There, David hears Goliath's taunt. He also hears what will be done to the man who defeats Goliath at verses 25 to 27. David does not agree that Goliath has come to defy Israel, much less the servants of Saul. Goliath is defying the armies of the living God, a phrase used by Moses at Deuteronomy 5. And the reproach to be taken away from Israel is the reproach of not having trust in God. What David is saying here is, what's wrong with you, Israelites? Do you not know who you are? David's eldest brother, Eliab, understands what David's saying, but he resents what he considers David's ambition to see a spectacle of others fighting, telling him in so many words, "Go back to your sheep, shepherd boy." But David persists after telling his brother that he has reason to upbraid them. The people tell Saul about this, and Saul calls for David. David repeats to Saul the phrase, "the armies of the living God," the opposite, that is, of man-made gods, the work of human hands. So what's going on here? First, the problem that Israel faces, David is pointing out, is one of heart. Saul has lost it. He's lost his trust in God, and he sees now as man sees. rather than hearkening to God's word. David respectfully challenges Saul's heart, and Saul responds with an observation, cleverly delivered, to be sure, with a nice anadiplosis, that is, a rhetorical doubling back. You're a youth, and he's been a warrior from his youth. David's initial response to that argument addresses indeed Saul's human perception. I delivered my sheep from the paw of the lion and the bear. But David doesn't end there. He instead then attributes the delivery of himself from the lion and the bear to Yahweh. And on that basis, he states his confidence, his heart's confidence, that Yahweh will deliver him from the hand of this Philistine. We recall that the Spirit of Yahweh has descended upon David. As Saul was briefly, so now is David, a prophet. What is Saul to do with these words of David? They are politically an indirect challenge to Saul's rule, more effective than a direct challenge from Samuel. You, Saul, are supposed to be the king of the armies of the living God, Yahweh. Are you going to tell me and all these Israelites that you don't trust Yahweh? That he will deliver me? So Saul's response can only be, go, and Yahweh go with you. But that this is Saul's, that this response is at best a half-hearted trust is indicated immediately. Saul gives David his armor. But David is not at all a soldier. He's never worn armor and rejects it, saying truthfully just that. I've never tried it. And he's rather emphatically presented here as a shepherd, with his staff in one hand and with his shepherd's bag, into which he puts 5 smooth stones, and it's emphasized, even a script, and with his other hand holding a sling. The biblical message is, David is no soldier. God will deliver him. This most important point comes through now in verses 41-47. The word for disdain, Goliath disdains David, is bazah, a lofty despising of this mere pretty boy. That's a word that's going to be used subsequently to describe Michal's reaction to David's undignified dancing before the ark of the Lord in 2 Samuel 5. David is described by Goliath in the way that he was described when Samuel first saw him, when Samuel was told by God that God sees not as man sees. Goliath, like Saul, sees as man sees. At verse 43, we hear Goliath's trash talk of the type one sees today before WWF fights, and it includes a cursing of David by Goliath's gods. Let's consider now David's response at 45-47. At verse 45, David declares, you come to me in your own name with the product of human arts, sword and spear and shield. I come in the name of Yahweh. He doesn't mention Goliath's gods. They too are merely the product of human hands, like his sword and spear and shield. At verse 46, we learn David will follow the Israelite practice of beheading the leader of the enemy, but he'll smite him first. He makes clear this is Yahweh's work. He will deliver you into my hand. This response to Goliath's taunt, an apparent tit for tat, differs a bit from it. Goliath had said that he would give David's flesh, behemoth, body, flesh, naked flesh, also male pudenda or genitalia, unto the fowls of the air. Second, David says, I will give it to the beasts of the field, sadeh. David, for his part, specifies these are wild beasts of prey. That is, nothing an Israelite would eat. Even when trash talking, that is, David speaks as an Israelite. And third, they are wild beasts of the earth, eretz, not just this field. And he then makes this explicitly universal, saying that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. His intention, that is universal, amazingly so. This is the first of two important purpose clauses that David speaks. David acts for God. David does not, in the end, act for David, merely relying on God for his own purposes or even act for the Israelites. We may say that for Saul, God was an instrument, close to a somewhat annoying talisman, at most a powerful helper for his own ends. David, by contrast, makes himself God's instrument. If there's a God, a living God, he's not a being who can be used for one's own ends, but whose ends one must serve. The drama thus not only manifests the wondrous power of God in the very acts of his future king, but makes clear what Saul is never able to see. At verse 47, we're given the second purpose clause, followed by a change from into my hand into our hand. The reader has hitherto seen Yahweh win battles by parting waters, by hail, by rain, by thunder, by an opening up of the earth, by an earthquake, that is, through manifestly non-human means. Here, he acts through a single human, one manifesting the right heart, one who expects Yahweh to deliver God's enemy despite what to others appear to be visible odds against him, and most importantly, one who now declares as his purpose not the saving of himself or his people, but the manifestation to all the earth that there is a God in Israel. And in a second purpose clause, he claims that all this assembly may know that he saves not with sword and spear and shield. That's something absolutely crucial about God. Something we see from the start, again with children of Cain and his bronze workers. God saves not through technology. The stage for this had been set precisely by Israel having received a king and by the failure of that first king, Saul. We'd asked how God would make his way manifest under this, his new and greatest concession, that is, kings. We have our answer here. It reiterates the Mosaic understanding of God. All the earth is to learn of him, in a clear manifestation of how he works through human beings who possess the right heart, and not simply through non-human wonders, and works against those who choose human, artful means to human glory. Let's conclude the look at David and Goliath with the conclusion of the killing of Goliath after he's slain him with a stone from his sling. The Bible is emphatic. There was no sword in the hand of David. He beheaded Goliath with Goliath's sword. Even the attribution of courage to David, we could say, would be misplaced. Deborah, the prophetess in Judges, is the first and only person in the Bible to sing of courage, of risking or offering one's life in battle for Israel. The biblical narrator's term had rather been, God is with him. Our best guidance is found in Psalm 115 or 113:9 in the Vulgate, the famous Non Nobis Domine. O Israel, trust thou in Yahweh. He is their help and their shield. O house of Aaron, trust in Yahweh. He is their help and their shield, and so on. What's enjoined is not courage, but trust. Trust in Yahweh over and against what sight tells one is the case. Here also it's implied Yahweh is unintelligible. He does what he pleaseth. Obedience to him is founded simply on his promise, his covenant. You can't count on it simply. The trust is in his deliverance, but even that deliverance is accomplished so that he may be known to all the earth. It's making oneself an instrument of Yahweh. We're now in a position to understand Machiavelli's retelling. He's chosen it as the example to show the meaning of one's own arms in The Prince. Machiavelli is aware of the significance of the biblical account of David and Goliath, and indeed of everything that's at stake in this chapter. He turns to it in chapter 13, the third of 3 chapters on types of arms, that is, of one's armed followers. Briefly, he argues that mercenary arms are faithful neither to God nor to you. Auxiliary arms, that is, allies, are faithful, but to someone else, not to you. The conclusion is one's own arms are faithful to you, which involves fidelity of your followers to God. Machiavelli suggests the full meaning of one's own arms with the example of David. As we've seen, Machiavelli has presented Moses as succeeding because he was an armed prophet, and he here attacks another biblical teaching, claiming David refused Saul's arms so that he could give a good account of himself. And he ascribes to David the possession of a knife. The biblical David, as we've seen, acts in the name of Yahweh, God of hosts. He acts so that all the world may know there's a God in Israel, and that he saves not with sword, spear, and shield. Hence, the Bible insists, no sword in the hand of David. It's Goliath and the forgetful Israelites who rely on arms. And most importantly, David doesn't just rely on God, he acts for God. Machiavelli mischievously whispers to us, he had a knife. David acted for himself against Saul, and he quietly relied on arms, his own arms. To have one's own arms requires, in the first place, that is, that one abandon faith in God. Only in this way can one come to act for oneself and have people, as Machiavelli puts it in the next page, who are your creatures. A self-reliance is required, but a hidden self-reliance. Unlike a sword, a knife can be hidden. David could pretend to be relying on Yahweh and doing Yahweh's work while secretly relying on himself and his artifices. In the very way we could say that Korah and his fellow rebels had accused Moses of acting. Because Machiavelli sees what's at issue, he suggests this is the first step in having one's own arms, arms that are faithful to oneself. Atheism is the first step, hidden atheism. And as he makes clear elsewhere, by an understanding of and guidance by necessities, while, as he stresses in chapter 18, appearing to have the virtue of being religious. We understand what Machiavelli intends with this brief retelling of the story of David and Goliath through careful attention to the original. The biblical rejection of the Machiavellian understanding continues in the account of the subsequent course of Kings. There are, in fact, 2 other instances in 1st and 2nd Kings in which the Machiavellian understanding directs men who would rule, that of Jeroboam and that of the Assyrian captain Rabshakeh. We have time for only a few remarks on this. Everything turns in Kings on the meaning of the temple that Solomon builds in Jerusalem. He builds it neither for himself nor as a dwelling for Yahweh, who dwells in the heavens. As we learn in 1 Kings 8, the theme of this temple to God's name is repentance, return, shuvah. But this is not confined to the people of Israel, such repentance. For as we hear now explicitly from Solomon for the first time, there is no man that sinneth not. All men sin. All are worthy of punishment. All stand in need of repentance. And Solomon's prayer is that God grant the prayers of the repentant, even strangers, non-Israelites. The temple is to make known the name of God, and as Solomon declares at 1 Kings 8:60, that all the people of the earth may know that Yahweh is God, and that there is none else. It has the same purpose as David's slaying of Goliath, but that purpose now includes not there is none before him, but there is none else. The temple and the covenant with the mysterious, unintelligible, but righteous, loving, forgiving God, of which it is to be a worldwide witness to sinful men, is a means of proselytizing or apologetics, that is, explaining to all men through a temple to his name, Hashem, who God is. The temple is a very localized and local house to replace all other places of worship in Israel, especially in the high places. But it has a universalizing significance. But as we learn in 1 Kings 9, Solomon builds for his many wives altars in the high places for Chemosh, Molech, the abomination of Ammon, and others. As God himself tells Solomon, your many marriages to foreign princesses to anchor these diplomatic initiatives, they are a direct violation of my law. They bring with them worship of idols, which is eventually called the way of kings of Israel. Solomon's son Rehoboam replaces him. The kingdom is rent in two, with Israel under the rebellious Jeroboam as the northern kingdom, Israel, and Judah with Jerusalem as the southern kingdom. Jeroboam builds 2 golden calves and houses for these idols in high places in Bethel and in Dan. He does so for Machiavellian reasons. Jeroboam is his concern is a strictly political concern in building these 2 altars, 2 golden calves. It's quite different from what moved Solomon to build the temple for worship in Jerusalem. He sees the temple in Jerusalem as having been built to embrace the lordship of Solomon and of his son Rehoboam, not as what Solomon has described it to be. He gives the temple a human, completely localized or particularist and calculative reading of the kind taken up, as we've seen, by Machiavelli. He accordingly builds 2 golden calves, setting one up in each in Bethel and in Dan for the people to worship. All subsequent kings are judged on whether they follow his way or the way of David, and whether they tear down the altars in the high places. Josiah finally does so after his men have recovered, that is, rediscovered, the book of the Torah in the temple when it was being renovated. The praise of Josiah is, in fact, higher than the praise of David. His deeds show what hearing of the Torah can do, but his work comes too late. There's been too much sinning. It will be punished. The Babylonians will come, take the Israelites into captivity, and the book of Nebuchadnezzar does exactly that in chapters 24 to 25. Machiavelli invites his readers to a rejection of this message of the prophets and to a return to the way of kings, to their understanding and their arms. He calls for self-reliance and hence technology, and to the pursuit of worldly honor. He sides with Korah and with Jeroboam. And just as the way of prophets over and against the way of kings required a comprehensive devotion to the right way, the way of righteousness, revealed by one creative ruling God, so does Machiavelli's teaching entail a far-reaching renunciation of divine providence. If any doubts remain about this, they're dispelled in Machiavelli's teaching on providence and the conquest of fortune, chapter 25 of The Prince. This is the second of 2 chapters. It's the last one we'll look at. It's the second of 2 chapters with human in the title. But unlike chapter 15, it doesn't speak of human beings and especially princes, but only of human beings. The only chapter devoted to human beings as such, then, deals with the conquest of fortune. We have to try to see why. Machiavelli begins the chapter with a theological discussion, another first. If the world is governed by God, he argues, we have no remedy. Such governance discourages human activity and encourages quietude. Que sera, sera. Machiavelli claims that he at first was partly inclined to that opinion, but he's now persuaded that fortune governs only half our actions, and we govern the other half. I hope we can see the change that's taken place from the first sentence down to this one. God has been replaced by fortune. We govern half actions. Fortune governs the other half. Machiavelli's reasoning this is very peculiar and it's quite amusing. He says, so that free will not be eliminated. For the sake of free will, Machiavelli has eliminated God from the equation. In the Christian or Jewish tradition, of course, free will means the capacity to choose what's right. That is a freedom from compulsion. In Machiavelli's new understanding, it's the freedom to do what we deem beneficial to ourselves, not the freedom to choose what's right. As Machiavelli puts it in this chapter, or in the next chapter, it is that which allows us to obtain our own glory. The elimination of God, of a purposeful order of the whole, is necessary before one can begin the grand rebellion that Machiavelli here invites against the world and its apparently outrageous fortune. Fortune is something we can control by building dikes and dams before a flood comes, by technology, in other words, artful knowledge applied to reconstructing the world. We can, by our activity, by what he calls here our virtue, almost completely subdue fortune. We can prevent it from coming at all. And we can do so by using a knowledge of necessities against the blind forces of nature. That is Machiavelli's most comprehensive gloss on what he calls the effectual truth in chapter 15. Fortune doesn't exist as a power outside of human beings. What we call fortune is but a failure of human beings to exert themselves to the limit, to apply themselves to the task of figuring out those blind necessities that govern things and manipulating them to our own benefit. Plagues, floods, famines, those aren't sent as punishments. They're by no means outside of human control. The world outside of us is conquerable, but to conquer it, we have to become impetuous, unrestricted by any faith in a natural order, unrestricted by any sense of limits that would make us cautious, that is, moral, unrestricted by any faith in God. We must be prepared to adapt ourselves to the circumstances in which human beings happen to find themselves. We have to use knowledge for the sake of power, in the words of Francis Bacon. Let me sum up and conclude then. The world is a chaos to be reduced to order. It has no order that's not outside of human making. In particular, there's no justice that exists independently of human making. Human beings are fundamentally beasts who find themselves compelled by blind necessities, by bestial passions, and have to use their merely foxy or calculative reason in the service of those passions to build a world that's more comfortable for themselves. Philosophy, with its attention to necessities, must become a force for change. It has to become activity that's capable of figuring out how things work so it can conquer fortune and thereby bring about a world ordered to our satisfaction. It has to become science, scientia, knowledge, and not remain a quest for wisdom, especially on account of the need to overthrow the reigning biblical Christian orders in Europe. Theory has to become subordinate to practice. The philosopher has to become like the armed prophet, the bringer of new modes and orders. This call was taken up by Francis Bacon, by Descartes, by Spinoza, Hobbes, and Locke. Our way, the modern way, is the way of Machiavelli. It's technology over trust. But when concessions to human weakness and proclivities are made in the Bible, they're shown ultimately to produce a David and a Josiah. So too might even our technologically driven world do today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this compelling lecture. I would really like to go into philosophical questions, but I think we already have a solid ground now, so I would rather turn to practical questions. One of your main arguments is related to the idea that Machiavelli is basically eliminating God from the picture. So I think you quite convincingly use this argument, but my question is, so, okay, but what's the problem? So a little bit less provocatively, it's like, what are the practical implications we face in a modern world by the fact, or due to the fact, that God is eliminated from the picture of politics or political philosophy.
Okay. Hello? Is that on? Thanks, Adam. One of the, I think, major consequences of the elimination of God through technology is something that Nietzsche talks about, intellectual probity. And it's not only Nietzsche. Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict, speaks about this too, that it's much harder in the modern world to believe in God, that the world has been, as sociologists say, disenchanted, that every day you're faced with, every time you turn a light on, every time that you see a building going up, every time you see the effects of technology, you're seeing the effects of a transformed world. And you're thinking, that's better. The world is better than it was. It's no longer the case that the world that we were given, the terrible world we were given, is ours. Now, our world is much better, and it's better because of us. Now, how did we do that? Not through any devotion to justice, not through any devotion to any kind of high moral principle. As we all know, the enormous success of this technological project is through self-interest rightly understood. It's through capitalism. And that means that through the one mention of rights in the unamended American Constitution is mentioned in Article 8, Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall have the right to grant, shall have the power to grant exclusive right to goods and services, patents, copyrights, for the sake, it says, of progress, for progress. So our disposition has become not one of repentance, shuvah, of return. It's become one of progress. It's become one of what's ahead for us. How can we transform this world, which on its own is awful? So I guess that's how I would begin to answer it.
And another concept that seemed to be in the center of your lecture is heart, is human heart, in case of David. And it's quite funny that, or rather interesting that the last encyclical of Pope Francis, he's trying to tackle the issue of AI again and again and again. And he poses the question, what is going to save us from this AI or from this form of technology, because he always talks about this as in the framework of technology, and he says that poetry and heart. Okay, let's suppose heart is important, but on the other hand, as we know from Machiavelli, armored prophets are probably more effective than unarmed prophets. So can we in any ways reconcile the heart with arms?
Yes, I think so. I think that one sees that, in fact, this is what I meant by the series of concessions, that God ultimately grants the use of the arts for godly purposes. David becomes an amazing warrior. David turns out not only to be a good judge, but David is also a great warrior, much more so than his son Solomon, who never goes into battle. And there are other great, Joshua would be another example, but prior to Kings, that there are, the concession God makes to human beings is made with the hope that with this new form, with this new institution, nonetheless, there can be people of heart. There can still be, in fact, in some ways, more impressive people of heart. That's why I concluded on the note that I did, that despite the fact that we live in a world transformed by Machiavelli, it's quite possible that people of heart arise. And I don't think that they're only poets. It's just that the pull is the other way. And so to understand what's actually required of us, you could say, means that we have to think through what the direction is of this enormous technology. AI is only one part of it, destroying my students' lives, by the way. But
last question before I give the floor to you. You are talking about kings, you are talking about princes, and you are talking about judges. Yeah, we all have them now, but it seems to me that in the Western societies, they are either lost their power, or in some other cases, they even disappear. So can we really learn from like kings and judges and princes? So what can we learn in the era of political democracy from these special characters? Can we learn anything, or it's just they are all human and we are also human, so it's all the same?
Good. Kings is the political life in the Bible. We don't see any republics anywhere. We don't see any oligarchies or aristocracies. I mean, it's something like an aristocracy under the elders after David's father-in-law tells him, you've taken too much on yourself. Something like it, but it's really judges. What really directs the kings well are the prophets. In all cases, if they listen to the prophets, where are our prophets? I would say, rather than simply poets who are important, but where
are our prophets?
Where are our prophets? And I would say you have a number of them in Eastern Europe. That Solzhenitsyn, as far as I'm concerned, is prophetic. Also very learned, not all the prophets were, but he speaks with a prophetic voice. Václav Havel, certainly, and Václav Benda. These are people who are speaking in a postmodern way. That is, they have endured a hyper-modernity and its horrors. They've endured, that is, the outcome of the Machiavellian teaching that he who wills the end wills the means by any means necessary. And that they have come out of that able to speak to us about what's required to come up from under that rubble. They speak to us about, in a way that reminds very strongly, sometimes explicitly, of the call that one finds the prophets making.
Okay, please, anyone? Questions, criticisms, comments?
Good afternoon, I'm Peter Sitesh, Senior Researcher at the Danube Institute, and I would like to ask the professor about whether do you think it is possible that without faith come to a conclusion, a convincement that God exists?
I'm sorry, the last thing you said?
That God exists. So without faith, can we reach to a point of certainty that God does exist? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think that that's the way the Bible presents it. I think that it absolutely requires faith. It requires heart. But that one is led to it by one's moral concerns. and that for this reason one finds, for example, G.K. Chesterton arguing in one of his Father Brown stories that there was a Marxist in one of the stories, and he's very concerned with justice. And he says, so I knew he'd become a Christian. That there is a way in which that we sense that justice is either something that has divine support or it is not. That and so if you're asking, do we know by dint of reason alone that there is a providential God who becomes angry at injustice, who is pleased by what human... No, I don't think so. I think that that's something to which human beings are very often led, but the Bible gives, you could say, the most uncompromising, unremitting account of that God and of what he demands.
Okay. If no questions, I have a lot of okay, Callum.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much for the talk. I'm not a theologian, so it was all new for me, a lot of it. But I'm a social scientist in my background. I'm wondering, kind of a parallel in some ways to Peter's question. Obviously, today there is this sense that I think Max Weber said the biggest legacy of Protestantism is secularism, and though recently we've seen seems to be some sort of revivalist Christianity happening throughout the West, particularly in Catholic circles. But do you think that it's possible for order to, I mean, it's a very broad question, but do you think it's possible for order to exist without there being a God at the center of people's cosmology?
Without there being
a God at the center of someone's cosmology. It could be Allah, any society. Thank you.
Okay. So you mean a cosmos, order?
Yes, because I think we've largely, what seems to have happened in the secular era from my reading is that we didn't replace God with a secular equivalent. We simply excise the spiritual entirely as irrelevant. And it seems to me that there is a vacuum at the heart of the culture, which people are now backfilling with other ideas that have all of the naivety of young faith, not the wisdom of old faith. So you look at a lot of the social justice movements, you look at the climate movement, these are classic millenarian movements which tend to happen in periods of disruption. So my question is that, is this lack of God in the culture, is that an existential threat to simply social order, let alone a sense of what society should be? Thanks.
Okay, so social order, not an ordered cosmos.
The consequence of an unordered cosmos for social order.
Okay, so Kant, of course, famously said that one could have such a well-ordered society for a nation of devils so long as they had sense. That is, so long as they could think in a long-range, self-interested manner. I think Kant was wrong, and I think that for any thoughtful person who is thinking in terms of long-range self-interest as the ground of social order, that someone who thinks about it is going to say, well, yeah, I'd like the rest of you to be suckers so that I can get away with things that you think are contrary to your long-range self-interest. I'm going to hide my crimes very well. And it's the old story of Glaucon. I don't think that this was put recently very clearly it was about a year and a half ago, by David Brooks in the New York Times, and he was reviewing a book by Fareed Zakaria that spoke about the decline of faith in Europe, faith that had been absolutely crucial, Zakaria argued, to the prosperity of Europe, and that Europe losing it will also lose its prosperity and its order. And Brooks said something to this effect, that something has to be found to fill the hole in the heart that's been left by the loss of religion. I don't think there's anything that will fill that hole. That the deepest human longings for a kind of eternal happiness, and everything that those longings give rise to in our souls, those longings, there's no serious hope to fill those longings outside of religion. There is an alternative to it. There's resignation to one's own mortality, and resignation to a world that's finally going to collapse. But there's a certain sadness that would accompany that kind of resignation, even if it was serene, and it's certainly not something that you could possibly think would be the bedrock of a well-working society. So I would say, insofar as we are moral human beings with moral hopes and with moral passions, and that includes envy, jealousy, as well as a desire for justice, anger. So long as those are there will always be a need for and a longing for some kind of religious faith. You spoke, I'll just conclude with this, you spoke about what seems to be a rise amongst young Catholics. That's certainly the case in the United States. I'd be interested to find out if it was here in Europe as well.
Oh, I actually know that, I mean, in France last year, the rate of people being, I think, baptized, I think it was, have gone up dramatically, hundreds of %. And in the UK, in the last 4 or 5 months, we're Daniel Institute planning a conference next year on Christian revival with Pusey House in Oxford. And in the context of preparing that, I was doing some background research into it. And there's articles almost every week at the moment in the British press about this phenomenon in the UK. It's anecdotal more than data, perhaps, in the UK, but it's something.
Yeah, well, there's data out on it now, the past month in the United States, and the decline in church attendance has leveled off. It hasn't gone back up, but it has finally leveled off after many, many years. And a good part of that has to do with both evangelical Christians and Catholics. And in the case of Catholics, I can speak a little bit to it. It has to do in part with the things we've been talking about, but it also has to do with a very impressive clergy, raised, that is educated in under John Paul II and under Benedict. That the clergy that you see in churches in the United States now are infinitely better than the clergy that I saw when I was growing up. They were a joke, and nobody wanted to go because the music was awful, there was no reverence, there was, what does this have to do with God? So the Catholic clergy of the United States, the younger ones, are much better educated than they were, much more serious. There's now actually in churches, and again, this never happened when I was growing up, there are monstrances, there's adoration of the Blessed Sacrament in these churches. That, it used to be, we have safe spaces. So there's been a dramatic change. I guess what I'm saying is that the appeal that's being made now is both by more educated, more articulate, and obviously more impressive people in their moral lives. So that's part of it in the United States. That's what is answering to what you were describing earlier.
Thank you.
Okay, here we have a question. Sorry, please. This was first, and then Adam. Yes. Then Adam. Adam is going to be the last one.
Thank you. We're very brief. It is my understanding that the Catholic Church at the time banned or put on the index Machiavelli's The Prince, mostly because of this content.
The lowest level of the Index of Prohibited Books.
So my question is, are there, I mean, I assume you can pinpoint specific segments or passages or points in the text that particularly cause this kind of index or ban. But my question is rather, do we know of any specific counter literature, not necessarily from the Catholic Church, but basically from other actors who particularly targeted Machiavelli's prince, saying that there's an alternative. So there's another way of, another form of type of governance that's both practical and moral, according to the Christian faith. So shortly put, this is where I conclude, is there like Machiavelli challenged specifically?
I have a related question. What is it that a conservative mind is really drawn to Machiavelli, like Harvey Mansfield, the translator? I think it's related.
Okay. Does that accurately sum up your question? Does that accurately sum up your question? Okay. What is a conservative mind drawn by? That would be a question to put, I think, to Michael Anton, who's written on Machiavelli and is certainly conservative. So I'll leave that a lot of that to him, but I will say this, that Machiavelli's influence was such as to be disruptive of European politics as they had existed. Francis Bacon mentions him 10 times, always favorably. Benedict of Spinoza in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus mentions him and says, that doesn't just mention him, but highlights, especially chapter 15 of the Prince, new modes and orders, and moving away from imaginary republics and principalities. Both of them were open supporters of Machiavelli. It was easy to do that in Amsterdam for Spinoza. There was also not Oliver, but Thomas Cromwell was a follower, less openly, but a follower of Machiavelli. And so the followers at first were not, you could say, at all conservative. Spinoza gave birth to liberal democracy, or rather is the first one to spell out a liberal democracy, also the founder of Zionism, which is a secular Judaism. And with Bacon, Thomas Hobbes was his personal assistant, secretary. And Hobbes's Leviathan is the first to speak of natural individual rights over and against duties, and a series of other things. So I don't know what conservatives, I mean, maybe you could say there are certain people on the left who are so determined by the thought of Rousseau and his progeny, the very, very, very hopeful Karl Marx, that there'll be an end of alienation from labor, therefore an end of alienation from ourselves, therefore from others. We won't need the state, it'll wither away. That maybe some of them point to Machiavelli and say, no, look, this is what it's always going to be like. But I don't think conservatives are well served by pointing to Machiavelli. I think that it's quite a mistake. Though I do think that they would be well served to study him. They'd be well served to understand his thought and to understand really the principles of the modern world.
Just a short reflection to this question. I think the long history of Christian political thinking after Machiavelli is trying to do this. The problem is sometimes they just fall into the trap of idealism. So it's like to the trap of idealism. Just two examples, one good example and one bad example. The Prussian king, Frederick the Great, he wrote a work which is titled Anti-Machiavelli. And it's really bad. It's a really bad book because he was a great king, but not a great writer. because he falls into a trap of idealism. But I think, okay, this is probably some kind of self-advertisement, but I think Christian, because I'm dealing with this topic, but I think Christian realists it is a school from American Protestant political thinking, and I think they tackle the issue of realism of Machiavelli, and they are trying to do something out of it based on Christian ethics. So they try to combine the two. I think you have many representatives, better or worse, for as a response to Machiavelli. Last question from Adam, please.
Thank you. Adam Labor, visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute. I'd like to go a bit wider and ask you a question about social media, because it seems to me that, I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Among many young people, we've seen a decline in organised religion. I know that Callum's talked about simultaneously there's a rise in interest in Catholicism, but broadly among young people there seems to be a decline in organised religion. Yet a lot of social media is involved, demands a kind of validation in forms of likes. And I'm wondering, does that speak to something that's replacing religion? If we see religion, organised religion, or even personal faith as a kind of comfort in that there's something above us, there's something for us to key into, there's a set of beliefs for us that we're not alone. Now that's gone, people seem to be seeking something similar through pixels on their mobile phones.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but I'll check it.
I'm sure there is an answer, but I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess I would see those things as not so much a substitute for religion as a narrowing of a capacity to think. I think you probably agree with that. Attention spans are being reduced to what you could see on a Twitter video. We see this in our classes. And so it would be a kind of infantilization rather than, the kind of, sometimes Churchill actually once describes nationalism as a substitute for religion prior to World War I. And you could see that in nationalism there'd be a certain call to sacrifice. There would be a call to duty that it might be secular, but it would be something close to religion. I don't follow social media. I read reports about it occasionally. It doesn't seem to have any of that. It seems more like entertainment, but an entertainment that shrinks the mind, an entertainment that really doesn't permit one to even reflect on the kinds of things that might lead to faith or to a rejection even of faith. It strikes me as shrinking the mind and ultimately mindless.
Thank you very much. I think it's cheerful to have so many people here in mid-July talking about political philosophy. So thank you very much. I think we also touched upon many great questions, such as the Bible, Machiavelli, Yahweh and Fortuna, kings and princes, virtue and power, all connected to ethics and politics. So thanks for coming. Please follow the Danube Institute and have a wonderful night.